It's the FIDE Grand Prix Finals in Berlin. Hikaru Nakamura versus Levon Aronian. Now they couldn't be split after two classical games, so they've gone to tie breaks, and this is the first of their tie breaks. So Hikaru has white here, Levon black. Let's see what happened. So the game has literally just finished, really fun to watch. We had a Roy Lopez on board again, so I'm going to whiz through these few opening moves here. And we reach this position here. So bishop b3, castles, pawn h3, one of these so-called anti-martial moves, bishop b7, pawn d3 from Hikaru, and now Levon was the first one to deviate. So in their classical game, he went pawn d6 here, holding e5, very rock solid and standard. Today he went pawn d5. So it's a really enterprising way to play. You let white take here, the knight recaptures, you're instantly striking at the centre, getting piece play, but you are leaving e5 weakened, and it's not easy to play f6, as we can see because of this bishop. But this kind of comes back to the martial themes here of piece play, giving the e5 pawn. So Hikaru goes pawn to a4 here. I should say if you take immediately, which is possible, then after knight recaptures, rook takes, queen d6 is the main move. I'm not going down all of this stuff, but the main ideas here are that the queen side isn't yet developed, black's getting some big initiative, attack against the king potentially, lots of play. So instead of this, Hikaru went a4. Now we had knight into d4 from Levon, again giving this pawn. You don't want to take here, you give black a big cramping pawn here, very difficult to develop your queen side. So instead Hikaru just carried on developing, brought that other knight out to d2. Levon picked up the bishop pair, very nice, the knight recaptured, and now we had knight to b4 here. So it's making it difficult to go c3, of course. It opens up this bishop, but it does give this pawn on e5, really gives it in earnest, and Hikaru does now snap it off. So what's Levon got in mind? Well, queen to d5 comes, threatening mate now against this g2 point. You could drop the knight back here, but Hikaru went pawn to f3 instead, trying to keep that knight a bit more active in the centre here. So bishop d6 from Aronian, he activates that one more, clears the e-file for a rook. We had pawn d4 holding the knight, a rook came to the e-file. Now Hikaru exchanged on b5 here, we had the recapture, and he completes the development of his minor pieces with bishop to d2. It also means that black can't immediately win back the pawn here because you're hanging the knight at the end of these lines, and this just isn't good for black. So instead knight c6 was played, and Hikaru could exchange here, and you're kind of liquidating the position. You would emerge a pawn up, but it's very hard to prove that it's worth something, because this knight is a bit stuck, hard to get into the game. Black has the bishop pair, doing fine. So instead Hikaru goes bishop to f4, maintains his knight in the centre of the board there, and asks black, what's your next move? Now you can't immediately take this piece, because after pawn recaptures, now you have some tactical problems. Say you take here with the bishop, which we saw in the game. Well, now we can take on d5, the bishop recaptures, the rook takes, we've won a piece here, of course. And I'm showing this to demonstrate the difference between the game continuation. So Levon didn't take on e5, he played king to h8, a waiting move, going f5 maybe one day, but now we had bishop to h2 from Hikaru, and the key difference here is that that bishop can now be captured with check against the king. So if we see that play out, now Levon took on e5, because after the pawn recaptured, now if we go down the same variation, bishop takes on e5, this time after Hikaru takes here, which wasn't played, you're not winning a piece because you've got this Zwischenzug, bishop takes on h2 check. The king recaptures, then you pick up the queen, and we can see here the material is level, different game. But instead of taking that queen on d5, Hikaru took the bishop first. The rook recaptured, the rook took here, queen takes back, and now queen to d4 offers that exchange. Now Levon ducked it with queen to g5. There's now a pin, and he's threatening to take this f3 pawn here, as we can see. So Hikaru goes queen to c5, inadvertently defending against that threat, because now if you take, you drop this rook here, that's mate in 1. So this forces the queens off, as we can see here. We had this capture, the knight hopped in, and this is just a bit pleasant for white, as we can see. So the knight's already very active, pressuring that bishop. The rook is coming in very quickly, and the black king is further away than the white king. So Hikaru has some nice pressure here. We had bishop to d5, rook to a7, pawn c6 holds the pawn. The knight now came back to d3, and Hikaru is looking to remaneuver it to b4 here to hit both of these points. And now Levon could have considered rook to c8 immediately, not let the white rook sit there, but then there's still some plans for white to continue pressing. Instead he went pawn to g6, preparing to bring the king in. Now Hikaru went rook to c7, and you just can't go passive here as black. You have to look for some counterplay against the white pawns here. So rook a8 was played, the knight came to b4, and now best would have been rook a1 check. After the king moves away, then rook c1. So at least you're pressuring here after the knight, say, picks up here or picks up here. Different game, black has some chances, but still not easy. White has the pressure. Instead, after rook a8, knight b4, Levon went king to g7 instead, just trying to bring his king in. But this allowed knight takes on c6, winning a clean pawn, the bishop captured, the rook took back, and now Levon actually switched to the d file here instead. He didn't want to check and bring the king in with a tempo. You never want to improve your opponent's pieces for no good reason. So instead he switches back, now threatening rook d2. And here I was a bit surprised with how Hikaru played. He pushes his kingside pawns. I thought maybe he'd play pawn b4 instead, fix these two, then c3, something like that after rook d2. Okay, he's a clean pawn up, he's pressing. Instead he goes pawn g4 here, and after rook d2, pawn h4. So he allows Aronian to go pawn h5. Now whether he goes g5 or takes as he did in the game, what we'll see here is that the h4 pawn is now weak. So Levon immediately attacks that. We had b4 first, now rook d4, and you can't actually defend that pawn. So we had pawn c3, the rook captured here, king g2, rook f4. So the material is now actually level, and this is what I mean. Levon's just won that pawn back. White still has some pressure here because you've got this two connected passes here versus Levon still being split, but it's a levelish position now if black can play properly. But time's ticking down, it's not easy. So king g3 hit the rook, it dropped back to f5, maintaining pressure here. We had pawn f4, and now pawn h4 is a nice check and a diversion of the king. If you go king g4, we just keep pushing it. You don't have time to take here, or we're making a queen. You can't get across in time, as we can see. So that's why after this move, pawn to h4 check, the king simply captured. Levon took here, king g5, and now rook f3 came. King g4 hassled the rook again, and now that rook came to d3, keeping an eye on this pawn and making it really difficult for Hikaru to go rook c5 and pick up the b5 pawn, or he'll lose this one. So we had rook c5 now, king f6, king f4, king e6, king e4, and now Aronian had a critical decision to make. And to my eyes, when analysing this game, the simplest way to defend here looks like moving the rook across to this third rank so it stays on the third rank, say rook h3. Because now, of course, if you take here, we take here, that's a fairly simple draw at this level of chess. Both players have got passed pawns, but the rooks will come behind them, etc. But instead of this, Aronian goes rook to d8 here. So his idea is to cut the white king, but now Hikaru gets some different chances because he can take that pawn on b5, and he's got these connected passed pawns, of course. It's a lot trickier for black now. So rook d1 was played. We had rook b6 check. The king came to d7. Rook f6 hit the pawn. King e7 defended. Rook f3 back. Holds this one here, and Hikaru's taking his time. He's got those connected passes. So king e6, rook d3, pawn f5 check. The king came to d4, so you're not losing this rook. And now the rook slid away. You can't afford to exchange there. These connected passes will win the day, especially as the white king can get back so quickly here. rook e3 check was played, king f6, rook e8 keeps the king cut, the pawn came to f4, and now rook b8 was played by Hikaru, but he also had a really powerful check here of rook f8 check. Say the king comes up to stay with the pawn, well now you can actually play king c5, and this is a really powerful setup where the king is shepherding the passed pawns down the board here, and this rook is going to give itself up for this one at the right moment, but because you've got 2 versus 1, this is a one endgame for white. Instead, Hikaru goes in the other order though. He plays rook to b8 using the rook to protect these pawns, and then after pawn f5 in a moment, he brings the king back to cover this one. Not quite the most precise setup though, because it does give Aronian chances. So rook b3 now, king d3, king g4, king c2 hit the rook, and now here was a critical decision for Aronian. The players have seconds, it's really not easy, you can't criticise too much, but the only way to keep a chance of drawing here was rook a3, and just to show one line, say now white goes pawn to b6, we'll now pawn to f2, and if you come across with rook f8 to cover, well now you can actually go rook to a8, trying to decoy that rook away so that you can queen, and if you take here, you've got this skewer picking up the rook. Now this is actually still only a drawing position after this because white has the connected pawns, should be a draw with best play. It's just one line here though to demonstrate that Aronian did have some drawing chances with rook to a3. Instead he goes rook f2 immediately, and the big problem here is that rook f8 comes. It stops that pawn, and we had this exchange of pawns here, but now this c pawn is deciding the day. The king is just too far away. So here it was Aronian to move. He had to make it before time control. He played rook c5, but just a split second too late. His time dropped and he lost the game. So Hikaru wins this first tiebreak. I'll be covering the next one in a moment. And just to show you why this is a one position, the problem, like I say, is that the king is cut. So you can set up these Lucena positions. So the king would start marching in now. I just want to show you a sample line here. You can hassle the rook, but it can move away, and you just keep that king cut off. And even though you check the king, harry the pawn, the problem is white can soon interpose the rook. So here, say king c6, rook c8, rook c7. That pawn's progressing down the board, the king is too far away, it's a win for white. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next tiebreak.